Hi weaving friends, last week I introduced you to my new countermarch floor loom. If you haven't seen that video yet, that will be linked at the end of this video. But a few of you mentioned that you would really enjoy seeing a comparison video that talked about the differences between my Louet David loom and my new countermarch loom. So I thought it would be really fun to do a kind of a battle between the two looms, looking at all the different aspects of the two and seeing which one comes out on top. Each loom certainly does have its pros and cons, and so that's what we're going to go through today. And at the end, I will give you the result of which loom won the battle. I would like to preface this video by saying that I do actually love weaving on both of these looms, and this video is just a little bit of fun today, not to be taken too seriously, and of course it's all my own opinion and my own personal preferences anyway. But I hope at least you find it enjoyable to look at my looms in this way today. Okay, let the battle begin. The first and perhaps the most obvious difference between these two looms is in the size. Now this isn't really part of the battle. I can't feel like I can pit these two things against each other. It's just a fact when you compare the two that they are quite different in size. So here you can see me, little old me, standing next to the Louet David. This is the David 2 version that I have. And here, for comparison, you can see me standing against the Papu countermarch loom. So yes, one is much larger than the other, and if you yourself are in the market for a floor loom, this will be of interest to you because the space that you have available may decide which kind of loom you get for yourself. The next thing I want to compare between the two is that they are actually different types of loom. The countermarch has shafts that go up and shafts that go down when you press a treadle, and the David is a sinking shed loom, so the shafts always go down. So if we're talking about the size, the David is more compact and fits into a smaller amount of space, and the countermarch is much larger and I feel more sturdy. And so if I was going to include this point in the battle, I'd have to probably give it a tie because both are good in their own ways in this respect. All right, let's get properly stuck into this battle. Round 1, initial setup. Well, this one is really easy. There is a very clear winner in this regard, and that is the David. When I bought the David, it was brand new. It came in boxes and of course all the pieces were in little bags and everything. And it was my first floor loom, and my husband did most of the setting up with me looking on. That's how we tend to do things because he's really good at setting things up and he enjoys the challenge, and I can point out the various things that need to be done. It's just a nice way for us to work together. So when the David came in its boxes, it did look like a lot of pieces, but the instructions were fairly reasonable. As many new loom instructions go, they really could have been better, but we made it and we got it put together. The initial setup, I would say, took maybe, let's say 1 day to be conservative. The countermarch loom I bought secondhand. It also came in pieces, but the pieces were all wrapped up for transport. I didn't have many instructions to go by, and once again my husband put the frame together, and then we did a lot of the setting up of the jacks and the lambs and the treadles and all of that together. But this was a really long process. Now we did work on this over a week's time because there were other things happening. We were sick at the time and just couldn't devote the constant time to putting it together, but it certainly did take a lot longer and it was a lot more complicated. So the winner for this round of the initial setup is the David. Round 2, ease of beaming. So beaming is basically taking the warp from your warping board, putting it on the back apron rod and then winding it onto the back beam. And it's that whole process of how you do that. And that's going to differ with different looms as well. For example, on the David, the rattle is built into the top of the loom. And so you do a lot of the work for the rattle, spacing the warp out, standing up at the back of the loom and then beaming from there. Whereas with the countermarch, I used a rattle that my husband made for me because I don't have the sectional beam set up for that yet. And so I placed the rattle on the back of the loom and beamed the warp that way. I think that both of the looms are really great for beaming, pretty easy going, pretty simple process. The only real difference that I can think of, besides the rattle being on top with the Louet David, is that also with the David, because it's so small and compact, I can actually stand at the front of the loom, hold the warp, and then turn the back beam myself to wind on. Whereas with the countermarch, the back beam is way too far from the front of the loom to be able to hold the warp, to tension it, and then to wind on from the side as well. It's not really an issue, it's just you have to do things a little bit differently. So for the larger loom, I did a bit of the yank and crank kind of method, where you have a big roll of paper or whatever you're using as a separator, and you come around to the front and you pull the warp out tightly, and then you go around the side and you crank it a couple of times, and then you come back and you pull the warp out again. And the idea is that you've got the roll of paper in there and it sort of holds the tension. Each time you pull it, it tightens itself up for the next roll. Just a different way of doing things. So for this round, I have to give the two looms a tie because neither one is harder or easier than the other to beam the warp. Round 3, threading. Well, this one I have a very clear winner. Although I have always found the David fairly easy to thread, the treadles are set up in such a way that it's a little bit difficult to get really close to those heddles while you're threading. This is important for someone like me who experiences a fair amount of back pain, and I need to be really careful about the way I do things so that I don't end up flat on my back for days in bed afterwards. So I've always found with the David that I could manage the threading as long as I didn't do too much in one sitting and I got up in between threading, had a stretch, etc. Now with the new countermarch loom, because it's so large and there's such a distance between all of the components, I can get the weaving bench right inside the loom, and so I can be sitting directly up at the heddles, and so I find it much easier to thread, simply because I'm closer and I don't have to have as far to stretch. So the winner of round 3 is the countermarch. Round 4, slaying the reed. Once again, there's not too much difference when slaying the reed between the two looms, but again, because my bench is right inside the loom with the countermarch, I do find that I can get that little bit closer. Therefore, it's just a little bit easier to slay that reed. I know that some people like to lay their reeds down horizontal and thread them that way. That's not my preference. I like to keep them upright. And so the closer that I can get to that reed, the better. So the winner of round 4, slaying the reed, is also the countermarch. Round 5, treadle tie-up. Oh boy, the winner of this one is really clear. So with the David loom, you have Texsolve ties, and to tie up a treadle, all you need to do is slip one of the loops over one of the screws that are sticking out of the side of the treadle, tie up any corresponding shafts that you need on that treadle, and then move on to the next one. You do need to get down on the floor, but each treadle is relatively quick to tie up with this system. With the countermarch loom, you also use Texsolve cords, but there's quite a different system. The cord goes through a hole in the treadle corresponding with the shaft that you need, and then there's a little plastic peg underneath that you stick into the hole for it to hold there. This system is fine because it's really strong and works really well. It just means that you need to get underneath those treadles yourself, and it's quite difficult, and I found this part really hard on my back. Also with the countermarch, you're not just tying up the shafts that you need for each given treadle. You also have to tie up other cords belonging to lambs so that every hole in your treadle is tied up. So if you're using all 10 shafts, all 10 holes in the treadle have to be tied up, and that has to be happening for every single treadle. Now, after my last video, a few people gave me ideas of how you can avoid getting underneath those treadles so much, and I'll definitely try them out in the future. But for my initial setup of my treadles for my first project, I found this part the most difficult. So the clear winner for this round is the David. Round 6, weaving with the treadles. So the David has 10 treadles, and they are all really well spaced apart, and they're all fairly light treadling. At the moment I have a double width project going on this loom, and some of the right hand treadles are quite heavy to treadle because most of the shafts are tied up on those treadles. But if you're treadling, let's say, just an ordinary twill with perhaps 2 shafts tied up to each treadle, it is extremely light treadling and extremely quiet. The countermarch, on the other hand, has these kind of floating treadles. This is something new to me that I'm not quite used to. The treadles are very close together and they do move about as you weave, whereas the David treadles are fixed. I am slowly getting used to the different treadling, but if I'm to pick a winner, the definite winner for the treadles for usability is the David. Round 7, the beater. If you saw my last video, I was raving a little bit about the countermarch beater, and I still feel exactly the same about it now as I did then. It still really excites me to use it, and I really love using it. I find that it just gives the perfect beat and it's just so easy to use. I love the design. The beater on the David is a gliding beater. This is something that they brought out for their David 2 model, and I've been interested to see that with the David 3 model that came out recently, they no longer have the gliding beater. That makes me wonder, was the gliding beater not such a successful idea? What I find with my gliding beater is that I really need to lubricate the metal rods very frequently for it to slide freely enough to be comfortable. And of course, I'm completely in control of the amount of force that I beat with the gliding beater. So I don't find it as user-friendly as an overhung beater because there's no momentum with it. Like, that gliding beater is not going to move unless I move it myself. Whereas an overhung beater or a slung beater will move, they have a rocking motion. And I feel that like that's just a little bit more ergonomically friendly. And I also just find that type of beater really easy to use. So the winner for this round for the beater is the countermarch. Advancing the warp. The Louet David has a friction brake at the side of the loom. This means that you can release tension without having to get up from whatever you're weaving and then just increase the tension at the front beam quite easily. With the countermarch loom, because of the size of the loom, you need to actually get up and walk around the side to release the tension at the back and then increase the tension at the front. Now, from what I'm saying, you would think that I would be saying that the countermarch is not as good as the David for advancing the warp and changing the tension. But actually I prefer the countermarch, and that's because the tension is really great, wonderful tension on this loom. But also, even though I have to get up and go around the side to change the tension, I actually don't mind that. I feel like that's a little bit more user-friendly in some ways than sitting there and just releasing a friction brake and then winding it on, because it's giving your body a little bit of a different task to do just for a moment. It's a great reminder to hop up and have a stretch and just not to be in the same position for too long. But that's not the only reason. I've always had a little bit of trouble with the friction brake on the Louet. It's frictioned by a spring and a metal coil, and I find that the metal comes loose fairly often and I have to rewind it. And also it's difficult to tension it just right before I start weaving so that it releases adequately when I'm weaving. What I've found is that often I'll use the friction brake and it won't release enough or at all, and then other times it's over tensioned and it releases too much all at once, which can be annoying as well. I just really like the simplicity of the countermarch and the way that the warp is tensioned there. I find that very easy to use and extremely logical. So the winner of this round is the countermarch. Round 9, variety of projects. Well, this one is a little bit hard to compare. It's a little bit unfair because you can probably tell already that the countermarch does have the advantage in this respect. It has a much greater weaving width. This one has 150 centimeters weaving width, whereas my David has a 90 centimeter weaving width. And the countermarch also has 10 shafts and 10 treadles, whereas the David has 8 shafts and 10 treadles. Even if I only had 4 shafts on the countermarch loom, I'd still say that the possibilities of different types of projects is much greater simply because of the weaving width. You might think that 90 centimeters is a pretty good weaving width, but the thing is, once you start weaving a lot of variety in your projects and you want to be weaving blankets and you want to be weaving cloth for clothing and all kinds of things, like as many things as you can possibly do, then 90 centimeters, you've got to add in your shrinkage as well, so you're never going to get a cloth that is actually 90 centimeters wide. It just isn't quite wide enough. Not for me anyway, because I like to do wider projects. So that was one of the main things that I was looking for in a new loom, was the extra width. So the winner of this round is the countermarch. Round 10, warp efficiency. Now, it's a little bit funny to put this one in because I can't give a really honest comparison of this one just yet, but it is something that you would want to consider when you're purchasing a loom. So the reason that I can't compare it really properly yet is because I still have my first project on the countermarch. I haven't actually finished it yet. And so I'm not exactly sure how close to the back of the shafts the warp is going to be able to come and how much waste I'm going to end up with. So I'm going to say at this point that it's a tie, but I may change my opinion on that later on when I have a little more experience weaving on this loom. Certainly you do have to put on a longer warp to start with on the larger loom, just because it's so much longer from front to back than the David is. So in that regard, I don't need to use as much warp on the David, but I think that overall it would probably even out to be about the same. So for this round, for now, it's a tie. Round 11, beginner friendliness. So when I bought my David loom, it was my first ever floor loom. I had been weaving on a table loom before that, which was an awesome stepping stone towards weaving on a floor loom. The table loom just taught me so much about what weaving on a multi-shaft loom was all about. But I've thought recently, especially in regards to this video, if I was to advise someone who was going to buy their first floor loom about the type of loom that I would advise them to buy, it had me thinking about the loom which was most beginner friendly. It is hard for me to compare because the David was my first floor loom and the countermarch is my second floor loom. So weaving on it has been doing the same set of actions but in slightly different ways because it's a different type of loom. But still I had that knowledge built up from years and years of using my David. But all things considered, when I think about all of the ins and outs of both looms, I would say that the David is a much more beginner friendly loom for someone who's starting out on a floor loom for the first time. And I would say that in almost every aspect, it is more beginner friendly, more simple, and probably easier to understand. You could get up and weaving faster on that David than you could on the countermarch. So the winner of this round is the David. Round 12, affordability. Well, this one is really tricky because the countermarch I bought secondhand and the David I bought new. Okay, so when I bought the David, maybe I was trying to remember when it was, 6, maybe 7 years ago now. Things were a lot cheaper, new things. As we all know, things have gone just skyrocketed recently, and that's across the board with everything, whatever you're buying. So when I bought my David, it had to be imported into Australia, and then it had to get to my place in Melbourne where I was living at the time. So it was imported into Australia from an agent or a supplier, and then she and her husband were kind enough to actually deliver it to my place, even though they lived interstate, which was just great. And the cost of that brand new loom at that time was just under 5,000 Australian dollars. For me at the time, that was like one of the biggest purchases I had ever made beyond something like a car or a house. It seemed very extravagant, and I promised my husband that I was going to make it pay. Well, I guess I did. Now, when I bought the countermarch, I bought it secondhand. The loom itself was 1,800 Australian dollars. And then the freight, because we had to have it brought down by removalists and it had to change over in Melbourne and go with another bunch of removalists, the cost of actually getting it here cost more than the loom itself. So the freight from memory was around 2,200, And then my husband and I had to also travel to a pickup point to pick it up and then return here. So that was a little bit extra in petrol money as well. But all in all, the cost of the countermarch was around 4,000 Australian dollars. I still don't have every single thing that I need for this loom, particularly if I want to use the sectional beam, but that can all come down the track. So that's about $1,000 difference between the two, and I was very happy with the cost of this loom, and it's in beautiful condition. I never mind whether something's new or secondhand. It's more about what the thing actually is and what the value is to me. But from a purely financial standpoint, the winner of this round is the countermarch. Round 13, the shed. This one's a little bit controversial because I've seen a lot of weavers say that the shed only needs to be big enough for your shuttle to pass through. The shed being the opening when you press down the treadle and your shafts go up and down. It's the opening. It's how much space you have to actually pass that shuttle through. The countermarch has a much slimmer shed than what I'm used to. Yes, I can get that shuttle through, but I would prefer the shed to be a little bit larger, and I'm still thinking about tweaking a few things with this loom to see if I can just improve that naturally myself. The David has a very large shed and there's plenty of room for the shuttle to pass through. The size of the shed becomes a problem when sometimes if your sheds aren't quite as clear as you would like them to be. You may view your shed from the side and you may notice that some threads are staying down a bit, or they're intruding on the clarity of your shed somehow. And so the larger the shed, the easier it is to see which threads should be where. And so for that reason, I would say the winner of this round is the David. Round 14, tension. So when I say tension, I'm talking about the warp tension and the amount of warp tension that the loom can actually hold. Both floor looms can hold a lot of tension. However, I have been really super impressed with the tension of the countermarch. And this is something that countermarch looms are really known for because of the shafts going up and down with your treadling, not just up and not just down. The tension remains more even across the warp. And while I think the tension on the David is really good, the tension on the countermarch is definitely superior. And so the winner of this round is the countermarch. Okay, so that's all the rounds. Let's tally the results and see who won the battle. Well, the tally for the David was 4 rounds. The tally for the countermarch was 6 rounds. And we had 4 rounds that were ties. So overall, the countermarch just made it a little bit higher than the David as the winner. But as I said at the beginning, I love weaving on both of these looms. They both have projects on them at the moment, and I spend an equal amount of time at each one. And if anyone wants to ask me for a recommendation, I recommend both. If you're interested in finding out more about the Louet David, remembering that mine is a series 2 and I don't believe they are available any longer, they're just making the series 3. But I'm going to leave a list of resources down below because I have made other videos about the David that you may be interested in looking into. They're still very relevant for the David 3 as well. I want to say thank you to everyone who commented on my last video introducing the countermarch as well. You gave me some really great ideas. One especially a few of you mentioned was the being able to move the knee beam to get that warp up off my legs. I did that. It worked an absolute charm. So thank you for that, and I'll remember that forever after. And a lot of you said that you're interested in seeing the sectional beam and the fly shuttle in the future, and I will be doing that when I get to it. Well, I hope you enjoyed today's video. Don't forget to leave me a like and a comment down below, and subscribe if you haven't already done so. Until next time, happy weaving.